What if I told you that the most human person who ever lived never sinned once? And no, I'm not talking about someone who was robotic or fake or superhuman. I'm talking about the person who showed us what being truly human actually means. There's this idea that keeps floating around that to be human means to sin. That making mistakes and falling short is just part of the package deal of being human. And when people hear that Mary never sinned, they think that somehow makes her less relatable, less human, less like us. But here's what they're missing. What if being sinless isn't about being less human? What if it's about being more human than any of us have ever been? Today we're diving into something that a really smart guy named Blessed John Henry Newman figured out. He was a convert to the Catholic faith, and he had this incredible way of explaining things that just makes everything click. And what he said about Mary is going to change the way you think about what it means to be human. So here's the thing that trips people up. When someone says Mary never sinned, the immediate reaction is usually something like this. Well, that's nice for her, but that doesn't help me because I sin all the time. She must have been different from us. She must have had it easier. She wasn't really human like we are. This creates a problem because it makes Mary feel distant, unreachable, like she's on a completely different level and we can't relate to her at all. And if we can't relate to her, then what's the point? Why should we care about her or learn from her? But there's a bigger problem underneath all of this. The real issue is that we've gotten it backwards. We've started thinking that sin is normal and that being sinless is weird. We've made brokenness the standard and wholeness the exception. And that's not how God sees it at all. Let me take you back to the beginning. Not the beginning of Mary's story, but the beginning of everything. Back to Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. When God created Adam, he didn't create a flawed, broken person who was destined to mess up. He created someone in his own image and likeness. Think about what that means for a second. The God of the universe, who is perfect and holy and good, made a human being to reflect who he is. That was the original plan. That was the blueprint. Newman explains it like this. Adam's nature was fragile, yes. It was limited and imperfect in the sense that he was a creature and not the creator. But here's the key part. His nature was stamped with a divine seal. It was supported and lifted up by grace that lived inside of him. God's own presence was dwelling in Adam, giving him something he couldn't have on his own. What did that look like practically? Well, Adam didn't have wild, out-of-control emotions and desires running his life. Those things existed as possibilities, sure. They were latent, waiting in the background. But they weren't in control. He wasn't confused or ignorant about important things because the light of God's Spirit was making everything clear. His reason, his ability to think and choose, was completely in charge of everything else going on inside him. And even more than that, his reason was submitted to God's will. It wasn't just his soul that was in this perfect state either. Even his body was different. It wasn't pulled around by random cravings and appetites. It wasn't heading toward death and decay. Instead, it was promised immortality. Adam was never supposed to die. That wasn't part of the original design. This is what Newman calls a supernatural state. And if Adam hadn't sinned, here's what would have happened. Year after year, he would have grown in merit and grace. He would have become closer and closer to God. He would have gotten better and better at being who he was created to be. And eventually, he would have moved from paradise straight into heaven. No death required. Just a transition from one perfect state to an even more perfect one. But we all know what happened next. Adam fell. He sinned. And when he did, everything changed. His descendants, and that's all of us, were born in his likeness. Not in God's original likeness, but in Adam's fallen likeness. We inherited his broken state. And the world didn't get better. It got worse. God sent judgment after judgment trying to cut off the spread of sin, but nothing worked. Improvement seemed hopeless. Newman quotes Genesis here, and it's pretty bleak. Man had become flesh. The thoughts of his heart were bent toward evil all the time. Not some of the time. All the time. That's what sin did to humanity. It twisted us into something we were never meant to be. So now here's where it gets really interesting. God had a plan. A remedy had already been decided in heaven. A Redeemer was coming. But God wasn't just going to send a Redeemer into a broken world and leave it at that. He was going to do something that showed us what the plan had been all along. He was going to create Mary. Newman says that God purposed to do this great work suitably. And where did he do it? In Mary. He quotes Romans. Where sin abounded, grace was going to abound even more. The deeper the darkness, the brighter the light would shine. So what does this mean? It means that Mary is a specimen of what humanity was supposed to be. She's an example. But she's more than just an example, Newman says. She's a restoration. She's proof that God's original plan wasn't a failure. She's evidence that being human and being sinless can exist together. Think about what would have happened if Mary didn't exist. The entire human race would have passed away without a single person showing what God intended us to be in our original state. That would have been a victory for the evil one. Satan could have pointed to humanity and said, "See, your plan didn't work. You made them in your image and they all fell. Every single one." But that's not what happened. Because Mary exists. In the purity of her soul and body, Mary shows us what man was before the fall. She shows us what we would have been if we had risen to our full perfection. She's not an alien. She's not a different species. She's fully human. She's just human in the way God always meant for humans to be. Let's break this down even more because this is crucial. When people say that Mary's sinlessness makes her less human, they're working from a broken definition of what human means. They're saying that being human equals being sinful. But that's not what God says. That's not what the Bible says. That's not what the original design says. Being human means being made in the image and likeness of God. It means having reason that's submitted to God's will. It means having a body and soul that work together in harmony. It means being filled with grace. It means growing closer to God year after year. That's what human means. Sin is not part of the definition of being human. Sin is what happened when humanity broke. It's the disease, not the nature. It's the accident, not the design. So when Mary lived her entire life without sinning, she wasn't being less human. She was being more human than any of us have managed to be since Adam's fall. She was showing us the original blueprint. She was proving that the plan still works. And here's something else that's important. Mary didn't do this on her own power. Just like Adam had grace dwelling in him from the beginning, Mary had grace dwelling in her from her conception. That's what we mean when we say she was immaculately conceived. God preserved her from original sin from the very first moment of her existence. He gave her what Adam had before he lost it. Does that make her special? Yes. Does that make her different from us? In one sense, yes. But in another sense, she's showing us what we're all called to become. She's the preview of what redemption looks like. She's the first fruits of what Christ came to do for all of us. Newman is getting at something really profound here. Mary is not an exception to humanity. She's the restoration of it. She's not the weird one. We're the weird ones because we're broken. She's what normal was always supposed to look like. So here's the moment where this all comes together. When you look at Mary and you see someone who never sinned, someone who was full of grace, someone who was pure in soul and body, someone who said yes to God with her whole being, you're not looking at someone who's less human than you. You're looking at someone who's showing you what being fully human actually means. She's the answer to the question, what would humanity look like if grace had won from the very beginning? She's the proof that God's plan wasn't a mistake. She's the specimen that shows us we were meant for something so much greater than the broken state we're living in now. And that should give us hope. Because if Mary can be what God intended, then that means the original plan is still good. It means that through Christ we can be restored too. We might not be preserved from sin like Mary was, but we can be redeemed from sin. We can grow in grace. We can become more and more like what we were meant to be. Mary isn't standing at a distance saying, "Look at me, I'm perfect and you're not." She's standing right in front of us saying, "Look at what God can do. Look at what grace can accomplish. Look at what you're meant to become." Let me bring this all back together. The next time someone tells you that Mary's sinlessness makes her less relatable or less human, you can tell them they've got it exactly backwards. Sin is not what makes us human. Sin is what breaks our humanity. Mary, in her sinlessness, shows us what being fully human actually looks like. God's original intention for humanity was to be sinless, to be filled with grace, to have our reason submitted to His will, to have our bodies promised immortality, to grow closer to Him year after year until we pass from earth to heaven. That was the plan for Adam. That was the plan for all of us. And when Adam fell, that plan seemed lost. But God didn't give up. He prepared a remedy. And in preparing that remedy, He created Mary, a new Eve, a new beginning, a restoration of the original design. She is the perfection God originally intended, not as a replacement for the rest of us, but as a sign of what's possible. as proof that grace is more powerful than sin, as evidence that God's plan still works. So when you think about Mary, don't think about someone who's distant or different or impossible to relate to. Think about someone who's showing you who you really are underneath all the brokenness. Think about someone who's revealing God's original intention for your life. Think about someone who's giving you a glimpse of what you're called to become through Christ. Mary is not the exception to humanity. She's the restoration of it. And that changes everything. If this helped you see Mary in a new way, click subscribe for more.